Good morning. Welcome to Subro Sessions. Today we are on episode 2 of our topic, How to Make the Public Sector an Ally and Not a Public Enemy. My name is Leon Skaf. I'm a partner in the subrogation department at White and Williams, and I'm joined here by my colleague Matt.
Hello, everyone. Great to be back.
And also, we are here joined with our guest from our last episode as well, John Lightbody, who is president and chief investigator of Find the Cause Investigations and the retired detective sergeant from the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office of the Arson Task Force. Hey, John.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. Anyone who listened to our first episode should know that John is a wealth of knowledge, both from the public side and the private side. So we have a perfect guest here to kind of talk about both sides of the aisle and how we can work our subro claims dealing with investigators from public and private. So before we get into the topic again today, I should mention we're getting into fall here. We're about 4 weeks into football season. So I think we need to do our check-in here for the White and Williams subrogation fantasy football standings. Matt, how's your team doing?
You had to go there, huh? I kind of viewed this year as sort of like a hustling type year. I'm waiting for more money to be put down so I can start winning. So 0 wins and 4 pretty convincing losses, but it's a long season.
Yeah, I mean, you make my 2-2 look fantastic. So
And you know what? Last time I checked, my name is still on that championship trophy twice, so that means something.
the illustrious Parashas Trophy, you got it. All right. So let's get into our topic here today. If you listen to our first episode, we focused mainly on kind of site inspections and some of the nitty gritty of doing the evidence investigation and things like that. We're going to continue a little bit with that and then kind of focus on litigation as well. But first, John, we'd like to get a few more general questions so we can pick your brain a bit. So I'll ask you, can you tell us what's easier and harder about working as a private sector investigator as opposed to a public sector fire investigator?
So, in the private sector, as you gentlemen well know, the most difficult part I found so far is trying to coordinate a major large loss joint fire scene or laboratory investigation. It's like trying to corral cats, right? So, trying to get everybody together is most difficult. In working with engineers is very much a good thing. And once in a while, you'll find investigators and engineers that are going to tell their client what they want to hear, right? So I find that most difficult, but I enjoy the private sector. You know, we go in, we have the availability of bringing a lot of engineers. The easiest part in the private sector is while we were in the public sector, we had to worry about authoring affidavits in support of multiple warrants, whether it's a search warrant, communications data warrants, and all of those arrest warrants and interview interrogation rights and all that. Certainly, you don't violate anybody's rights in the private or public sector, but that's much easier not having to author all of those affidavits.
The next question I want to ask you, John, is a little bit of a variation on a question we asked you during the last podcast. And the last podcast, we had asked you, what's your opinion in terms of whether or not fire marshals in general want to help the private sector investigation, or whether they kind of appreciate that there's sort of some institutional safeguards in there that prevent them from sometimes being much assistance? This is a little bit of a twist on that. I'd like to know what you think in terms of whether or not fire marshals generally care what the private sector investigation ultimately comes up with in terms of a cause of the fire. Are they personally curious? Do they want to know? Because a lot of times it really goes beyond what the scope of their own investigation and duties are.
Well, I do. And to be honest with you, I see the younger fire marshals that are coming through that are new to the learning curve and process. They want to know what's happening and what we do. Too many times I've found, and I'm sure other private sector investigators who came from the public, certainly we walk up on a scene and the local authority, the public sector says, oh, it wasn't suspicious or the fire wasn't incendiary. We left it for you guys. That's wrong. Their job, obviously, we spoke about, is to determine the origin and cause of the fire, any cause or contribute to the spread or cause of the fire, and any fire code violations that resulted in extensive damage to the structure, serious bodily injury, or death, right? So I think, and I have invited public sector investigators to our scene exams because you have to include them and let them understand that you're trying to determine the same cause or come up with the proper answer, right? So in addition to that, I've invited them to lab exams so that they can understand how in depth we get with engineers. Unfortunately, they don't have that ability, but they have their subcode officials that can assist them, electrical, plumbing, building, and fire. But in that case, They come to the labs and they're amazed at what actually occurs. And I think us doing that from the private sector, extend that invitation, you're going to get a lot more cooperation from the locals, and they're going to understand that they shouldn't take apart the dryer to try and figure out the failure mechanism. It's beyond their scope, or the electrical panel, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's important to be inclusive, bring them in, and make sure that they are part of it so they have that mutual understanding and respect for each other.
Do you think that because a lot of these public sector guys are seeing their colleagues go private eventually, or maybe even while they're still in the public sector, that they're more interested in seeing how that goes because they know they'll be doing that one day?
Oh, sure. We get a lot of guys, I'm sitting in the background because I may need a couple of more investigators, and I know who I'm targeting, and they know that. And you, as a private investigator, if you've been through the training, education, experience, and had it all, can identify those that you wish to be there. And yes, I think they do line up, a future for themselves post public sector. But the greatest example of that is when I taught the Division of Criminal Justice classes in New Jersey twice a year. I had guys that had a year or two left before they retire, and they're coming to the arson class. So you know what they're doing, right? They're trying to beef up their resume to get a job in the private sector. Well, listen, this doesn't happen overnight, as you guys know. I'm in 45 years. And some of these guys, if you're doing this for 20 years, 15, 10 years in a busy department, that's great. You're in a slow department and you don't have those investigations, that experience, it's not going to help in the end. So I guess my point is if you're going to do this after you leave, get in an investigation unit now, 15 years in.
Right. What are some examples from your career where obtaining excellent assistance from the public sector, whether it's through documents or information, has helped make your case?
There's a lot of areas where I can cite that, but two jump out very much in my memory is, we had a major explosion in Ocean County at a house, and there's a police officer going back to his car. And those cameras, if you don't know, they film 24/7. When you hit the button, it captures 30 seconds before. So he's going back to his car. The house explodes. His back is to the house. He went right in his car and pushed the button. He caught the entire explosion on video, which was very helpful. And obviously, we worked with the Ocean County Fire Marshal's office and the prosecutor's office to assist us in coming to a conclusion on that fire. Another one was there's a fire in Passaic County, which serious bodily injury. The Passaic County prosecutor's office was the lead, and the sergeant there was tremendous in his investigation, his documentation, his work product as a fire scene investigator was tremendous. And he's one of those guys that want to learn and want to know, and subsequently may end up with us in the private sector. And it was just a tremendous asset, and mainly because I got that fire 2 years after it happened. So kind of like you're shuffling deck chairs on a Titanic, trying to figure out what went on. And then he was tremendous in his assistance.
Now, John, can you think of any times when you were working in the public sector and you were on a scene or otherwise involved in an investigation with a private sector fire investigator? And the way that private sector fire investigator was going about things, it was just the wrong way to you, whether it was investigative techniques, attitude, etc. And because of that, were you less likely to help him? And did any experiences like that in any way shape your approach as a private investigator?
And we want names, John.
Yeah, actually, I have one, but it's the funny story. Yeah, there are persons that come out, investigators from the private sector back then. That someone call you up and say, "Send me your report," and that's about all they would do on the scene, right? So, and there's others that want to do a thorough investigation, and we have disagreed on cause and approach. They didn't look at certain things, and they came to a conclusion without looking at it. And what I mean, I'll give you one specific example was we had a fire in Ocean County again. I use that a lot because that's my task force. I was in the public sector, and the private sector investigator came in, determined this fire to be incendiary, which it was not. And I asked his engineer, "Can you eliminate all the electrical conductors in the area of origin?" He said, "No, not the ones I couldn't see." Well, then there you go. It got so intense. We had a meeting in our office, and my captain, after that meeting, said, "If this individual comes back in my county, he's not doing an investigation, I want him arrested." That's a true story, man. And it's captain for major crime. And when I retired, I went in the private sector and met this guy on a joint exam. And I could tell you to this day, today, we are very good friends. We respect each other's ability and we work great together. It's a funny circle that came around because I looked at him and said, "You came to my county again. I was cuffing you." And he goes, "Yeah, all right." I said, "No, no,
John, I'm a former assistant prosecutor. And I'm not sure that's an arrestable offense.
neither do
But,
I, but
but how they did things in Jersey 20 years ago, who knows?
the threat of it kept it in line. I can tell you that.
Right. Well, we're going to shift gears a little bit in a second. Before I do that, I should just mention that when we're talking about the public sector, typically we're referring to areas like John was involved with the local fire investigators. But another consideration oftentimes is whether it's federal agencies, if you're dealing with the NTSB or the Chemical Safety Board, a lot of times these agencies will be involved for whatever reasons, and you got to work with them as well, whether it's on site, whether it's dealing with their evidence retention and coordination after the fact. So that can have different dynamics as well. But next, I'd like to talk about as we're approaching litigation and just getting into litigation now, I'm going to pose a question to Matt first. So, Matt, if we're in litigation and we have a public sector conclusion that differs from our own theory of liability from our expert, how do you typically best handle that?
Well, I think the first thing that any subrogation attorney needs to keep in mind and never forget is that juries tend to hold the opinion of the public sector investigator, the fire marshal, in high regard. And there's really two reasons for that. One is because they generally and justifiably have a lot of respect for fire department personnel. And two, juries really want to hear from the expert who is quote unquote unbiased. They know that the plaintiff paid for their expert's opinion. They know the defendant paid for their expert's opinion. And even though those experts may be the utmost integrity and they're never going to give you a particular opinion because you paid them, the view of the jury is always going to be somewhat that person's a little bit biased. They're being paid by this side. So they want to know what the public sector has to say. And as subrogation attorneys, if you've been doing this for any amount of time, one of the things you realize is it's actually kind of rare that we're going to get a public sector opinion that is exactly in line with what we have come up with. Not because we're wrong, but simply because they don't go into the specificity and the depth of investigation that we go to. A lot of times we're going to see that the fire marshal opinion is undetermined. If we have a fire marshal opinion that differs from our own, what I think the best thing you can do is find out exactly what that fire marshal did and what he didn't do. And to the extent you have to depose him, to the extent you have to argue to a jury, that fire marshal, him or her, that their opinion is less reliable, you just focus on those important details. You focus on the fact that the scope of their investigation was really about determining whether it was incendiary or not incendiary. Anything they did beyond that was really beyond what they needed to, and they didn't go into the level of investigation that our investigator went into. Also, oftentimes, as John pointed out, you're going to see a lot of differing levels of experience with public sector officials. If you spend 20 years being a fire marshal in one jurisdiction compared to 20 years for a fire marshal in another jurisdiction, and the difference in the amount of investigations they've conducted could be in the hundreds. So it's just important to very respectfully make it clear to the jury that if the fire marshal's opinion is different from your expert's opinion, to just say, look, this person is not a bad fire marshal, they're not an unqualified person, but in this particular case, with these particular facts and this particular evidence, they simply do not have the qualifications, the experience, or the depth of investigation that our investigator had.
Yeah, just tack on. I think that it boils down to you let the evidence speak for itself, showing everything that your investigator did, everything that the public sector did. Typically, yours will be much more thorough, much more comprehensive. And it's not, like you said, to disparage or fault the public sector guy. It's just he didn't have the time, he didn't have the resources to do what our own expert did to come to his or her conclusion. So, John, from your perspective, when you know you have a conclusion from the public sector that's differing from yours, does that affect in any way the way you approach writing a report, answering questions in a deposition, or so forth?
No, it doesn't. Look, part of my investigation to be thorough is to contact and consider the public sector's investigation efforts, right, and what they did. So that will never affect how I write my report. Well, I'll just put in there that we disagree and the reasons why we might, if you want that in there. But the point of the matter is, if you differ, and I think you pointed it out, Matt, the difference could be the training, education, experience, right? So a lot of juries, as you said, and this is concerning to me, you see, let's say, for example, FDNY Marshall. A juror sees that on a resume, it's like, wow, this guy did a lot of stuff, right? Maybe not. And you guys would do that through the voir dire and the qualifications, et cetera. So I find that in one particular case, as you pointed out, they're undetermined a lot. And that was guided by NFPA 921, the changes and the differences, right? And I find that concerning because you have heat sources in an area that you can identify as accidental. Circumstances surrounding the event are non intentional or not suspicious. So they can still do that. And you can't eliminate an electrical malfunction in a conductor or an outlet, et cetera. And that's it. They can still call it accidental. And that's what they can't eliminate. And then they have that always, this opinion shall remain unless other evidence, physical or scientific, is presented to alter same. So the point of the matter is they can call it accidental, incendiary, and undetermined. They're afraid to do that because of that document that has changed over the last publication, right? But it's up to you, the private investigator, to consult with the public investigator, explain to him or her how you got to this conclusion, and whether it was more thorough or less thorough, I don't know. It comes to that. And then you have a conversation about it. We're going to have differencing opinions. One of the things I find most disturbing is verbiage. I had one fire that was an accidental fire. We found a failure in the conductor in a ceiling. That was the origin of the fire and the cause. And we proved that through electrical engineering. And my report simply said we can't eliminate energized electric in a conductor. His report said he can't eliminate an electrical equipment. So that equipment and conductor made a half-hour deposition. That's just one question. Well, why would he do this? Why would he do that? And I had to end it with, well, counselor, maybe our training education experience is a little different. And then he stopped. And it's tough. You just got to be inclusive. You got to include you guys and gals. Some of them, like you said, only get. I live in Tom's River. We have a big Bureau of Fire Prevention. There's 4 inspectors, all of which are exposed to investigations. You may get 500 calls a year, but out of 14 of them, they're getting whacked up. They're only getting 10 a year. So how long does it take you to get 500? I'm in the area of close to 3,500. So that's a long time. That's a long time.
Yeah, and on the contrary, if we have a public sector conclusion that's in line with our theory, I guess I'll pitch it to Matt first. What's the best way to bolster our case using that public sector report or theory?
Well, first of all, that's a great development from our perspective because we're just not used to having the public sector opinion perfectly line up with what we're saying. And again, it's not because we're wrong. It just has to do with the fact that our investigators literally and figuratively tend to dig deeper than the public sector official is going to do on an investigation. But if you have that case where in writing, the opinion is exactly what we're saying, whether it's like this was a careless smoking fire, this fire originated at this recently installed wiring, this fire originated at this lithium battery. That becomes a very important part of your case when you're trying to negotiate a settlement ahead of litigation. Once you're in litigation, in my opinion, that's the first deposition you want to take if possible. And the good thing about a public sector official deposition is that it's not really dependent upon when certain discovery is provided by one side or the other or discovery disputes that could delay the deposition of someone else involved in the case. The public sector investigation is the public sector investigation. So if it lines up with how you view the case, I think it's great to do that deposition early on and kind of set the tone for the case. Have everyone involved right away when they think of this case, think, all right, this is the one where that fire marshal was just deposed and said this happened exactly the way the plaintiff is saying it did.
Yeah, and when I'm deposing the adverse expert, my exhibit 1 is the fire marshal's report, and why is he wrong? Tell me why he's wrong. And again, a lot of these public sector investigators curry a lot of favor with juries, and I want to hear exactly why this adverse expert is going to say that we're both wrong, our private investigator and the public investigator. John, question for you on this topic. I mean, when you have the same conclusion as a public sector fire investigator, obviously that's a good thing, but how do you retain your autonomy and show that you came to the conclusion on your own?
Well, again, you go back to your work product. I mean, it shows in your report. My reports all reflect step 1 through 7 of the scientific method. They're all in there. And the fact that you've interviewed the local authority, you've obtained their reports, you've obtained their photographs, you relied on them for certain aspects, and then subsequently you did an independent investigation. But to go back to how you improve on that, counselor, on bringing those conclusions closer together, it comes down to us, the private sector, be inclusive and bring the public sector to our scenes, bring them to our labs, let them understand the depth that we've gone into to come to the conclusion that we have. And I'm not telling you they should change their opinion. Their opinion's their opinion, but at least have an understanding of how deep we go. So with that, that's what generally I would do to improve that. And individually, it's the evaluation, as you guys said, by the jury. Did I do mine independently or did I just say, well, I agree with this guy? Well, no, I did mine independently. It's reflected in my report.
Right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Very lively discussion. John, thank you for your time. I'm sure I'll catch up with you in a debris pile somewhere down the road.
Just keep sending them over, counselor. You can send them over.
Leon's going to be standing near the debris pile.
Yeah, far away, far away. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Subro Sessions. Be sure to listen to the next episode of Subro Sessions, which will be released on the third Tuesday of next month, November 19th in this case.
We would like to remind everyone that the contents of this podcast are intended for general informational purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation with respect to any specific legal question you may have. The podcast should not be construed as legal advice for a particular situation or to give a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.